I'm going to show you how I made this iPad sleeve and this laptop sleeve without a pattern. So the first thing is that I'm getting some batting to be able to make the laptop sleeve fluffy. I'm just getting some polyester batting that I had. As I said, I'm not using a pattern, so I just put my laptop and tried to make it fit on the batting. I took that as a base and I tried to put the iPad next to it to try to save the scraps and have not like the least amount of waste possible. So I made the iPad one vertical and the laptop one horizontal. As you can see here, I'm not following anything. So I do have to improvise the seam allowance, and you can see that the laptop and iPad are smaller than the piece of batting that I cut because I wanted to make sure that there's enough space for the iPad and laptop to fit inside once everything is sewn together. I'm making it so that it folds on top of itself, and I'm just verifying that it looks good. And I was very satisfied with it, so I put the batting pieces aside to get ready to choose the fabric that I was gonna sew with. And here I'm just looking at the fabrics, trying to see what would be best. I wanted something that was cute and I wanted to quilt it, so I wanted to make sure that the fabric I was going to choose would look good quilted. And I ended up choosing this one, the pink one with the stripes, because I felt like it would be really easy to quilt. I would just have to follow the lines essentially. So what I'm going to do now is just cut the pieces based on the batting sizes. So literally I'm just winging this. I have no idea what is going to come out of this. And as I said, I'm using the batting as a base. And I'm going to use this as the top layer and also the lining, which means I'm going to cut 2 pieces of the fabric per item. So that means I will have 2 times the size of this fabric for the iPad piece and then 2 times the size of this fabric for the laptop sleeve. Here I'm cutting the pieces again, but for the lining. And I decided to use the same fabric for the top layer and the lining just because I thought it would look good. Because remember, it folds over itself, so when you open the flap at the top, you will see the inside, so the lining, if that makes sense to you. I wanted it to look uniform and fluid, so I decided to keep it the same fabric. But maybe next time I would use something more funky and have like a pop of color inside, but I wanted to keep it simple this time. Now comes the quilting part, which is I would say, the most time consuming part because I decided to follow the lines of the fabric to quilt. And as you can see, there are many lines. And not only that, but I decided to quilt the pink lines only, but on each side of each line. So that means each line requires 2 rows of straight stitching. And that can be, as I said, very time consuming, but doesn't require a lot of focus. And I think it took me like an hour or so to get my 2 pieces of quilting done. I don't know how many lines of stitching I did, but I went through 2 bobbins, so I feel like that's kind of a lot. And so here I'm just changing the color of my thread. Since I'm going to be sewing only on the pink lines, I wanted the thread to match. Here I felt comfortable enough to sew at the machine's full speed because it was a straight stitch the whole time, and the more you do it, at least the more I do it, the more I felt comfortable and used to it. I did notice that the fabric did not fit perfectly on the batting piece, but it ended up being okay. I think it's because I didn't take into account the thickness of the batting, and so the fabric piece was a little smaller than the batting, but it did not end up being a problem at all. But for next time, I think I would make the fabric piece um, larger and longer. So this is what it looks like after it's done, and I did both pieces. And I'm just cutting the excess as I told you that I found to be there. Not much, honestly, but just I wanted to keep it clean so that when I sewed the pieces together, I wouldn't have a problem finding where the seams should be. And also to make sure that it's straight and clean. And this is what the quilting looks like. I really like this look. It looks so fluffy and it's thick enough so that I feel like my device is protected. And now I'm just folding it to make sure it looks good after cutting off the excess. I kind of want the sleeve to look like an envelope, and so I'm making it triangular at the tip, and I'm using a 60-degree angle from the middle to the left corner and right corner to make it not too pointy, but just enough so that it looks kind of cute. And so I'm just measuring the lines to make sure that they're equal on both sides. And I'm using an OmniGrid ruler. That is such a helpful ruler because you have the angles and the inches, the squares, everything. And now I'm just going to cut off the little pieces to make it look like an envelope. And now it doesn't look like much because it's not folded, but this is what it would look like potentially at the end, which kind of looks really cute. We're doing this as we go. I'm discovering what's going on. And since we had to cut off a lot of excess from the quilting piece because I did not measure the fabric's ratio to the batting really well, I also had to cut off a lot of excess from the lining fabric piece. But again, it was okay, no problem. But I will definitely take that into account next time I'm making one, and I'm just doing exactly the same thing to the other piece. I'm cutting them the same size because they're going to be sewn together and I want it to be easy to find the exact seam. And I'm also cutting off the triangle tip so that they fit together perfectly. Since I'm not using a pattern, every step of the way I like to fold it back in together and make sure it looks okay, or at least going in the right direction. I also want to add my logo, so I put little marks in the middle of the top flap where I will add my logo, and I want it to be centered. I didn't really measure where it would go. I just, as I showed you, folded it and saw where I felt like it could go and would look nice. And I'm getting two tags and just checking where they should go and sewing them on top of the top layer. And I did that before sewing it with the lining because I like a clean look, and without doing it with the lining, you can't see these stitches at the end, which looks very neat. This is what it looks like with the tag on, and now's the time to sew the quilted piece to the lining together. And it's very important to put them right sides together And here I clipped them just for some, like a guide, I guess. Although I didn't end up feeling the need for clips. I do like to overclip than to underclip because sometimes it can make some mistakes and you need to pick those stitches one by one, and that can be very time consuming. So what I do is that I put the two pieces right sides together and I just sew the edges. I did not measure a seam allowance. I literally just went with the flow and I just sewed all around it except the bottom because I'm going to use that opening to flip it right sides out. Here I'm just going to cut off the excess of the seam allowance that I had because when you turn it right sides out, it's going to be bulky if I don't remove that seam allowance, especially because it's quilted. Now I'm flipping it inside out. I'm also making sure that I'm picking the corners so that they're actually pointy and don't stay inside. I think a very important piece of sewing is ironing. So I made sure to iron with a lot of steam so that I was able to control exactly where the seam should go because I was going to do some top stitching. And there was an opening so that you could flip it inside out. So I'm just making sure to close that. What I'm doing is that I'm just folding it inside of itself. Again, no measured seam allowance or anything. I just wanted to see where my intuition could get me. And I just ironed it to make sure that it could stay in place while I was sewing it and clipped it. I really found that ironing makes a big difference. I know it's simple, how powerful an iron is for projects. And now I'm top stitching the opening, and I try to stay as close as possible to the edge so that we don't miss any fabric along the way. Now it's time to actually put it all together. Initially, I was thinking to myself, like, how am I going to do this? I was coming up with ideas on the spot, and I thought that maybe I could sew it right sides together and then flip it out. But then I was like, wait, no, I can just fold it simply and just stop stitch it all around. Also, if you're wondering, I didn't watch any tutorials prior to this, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to discover the process myself and see where my progress of sewing has brought me so far. Something that happens a lot with projects that require a lot of thread is that I have to change the bobbin a lot of times. But I do try to make it so that it's optimized in some way. When I started sewing, I saw myself finishing the bobbin in the middle of a stitch. And so that was kind of frustrating because it wasn't secure. And if you wanted to secure it, then it would kind of look janky in some way. So I learned to kind of optimize the times I recharge my bobbin. I know it sounds very simple and maybe obvious, but it was kind of a skill that I had to learn. And now I'm just stop stitching all around. For the bobbin thing, I usually check where the bobbin is at and see if I should be worried if I have time to finish my stitch or not. And that helped a lot actually. And that's what it looks like when it's top stitch all around. And I feel like the top stitch gives it a really beautiful look, especially on the flap, like the triangular part. Now we're in the final stretch. We only have a few steps left. So I'm just cleaning stuff up before the final steps, which are to add the straps. So initially my vision was to add 2 straps to each sleeve and create a bow out of these 2 straps to secure the sleeve, and that was completely improvised. I took a scrap of fabric from the initial fabric that I cut. I thought it looked long enough to make straps, so I cut it in half lengthwise, and then I cut it in half again, each strap, I guess, to make 4 straps. I had no idea if this was going to work, so I was like, if this doesn't work, it's fine, I'll just figure something else. But it did end up working really well, actually, so I'm kind of happy with that. What I'm doing here is that I'm going to fold it lengthwise, iron it, and then sew it. My idea was to be able to flip them inside out so that I could have neat seams. Then I was thinking of top stitching the whole thing because I really like the look of a top stitch on straps, but also it would allow to close the opening that I had, which is just a 2-in-1 really. So I'm just sewing one corner, one short edge and one long edge, and then it's folded lengthwise. So as you can see, there's only one tiny opening at the end, and I'm using my loop turner to flip them inside out. That makes some really beautiful straps. It's very foolproof, I feel like. After that, what will be left to do is to actually close the strap. And I'm just going to take the same technique as the laptop sleeve, how I close the opening there. I'm just going to fold the seam allowance inside of the strap and just top stitch it. Just some cleanup, trimming the thread. I like to do that at every step so that at the end I don't have a lot of thread coming out. It just keeps things clean. And now I'm going to pin these straps to the sleeve. I try to keep them in the middle, and I'm just pinning them to align them and see if I like the look of it. And I'm doing it in a way so that when the straps are tied together, they are tied easily and we don't really see how the stitching is done, which I really like. And the tricky thing here is that I'm going to sew like a small rectangle on the strap so that it keeps it secure. Not just like a one straight stitch, right? Just like a whole rectangle. What I didn't think of is that it's kind of complicated to sew the strap on the envelope and not on the flap. As you can see, I'm kind of struggling. And I realized that this is something I should have done before assembling the strap, the sleeve together. But you know, you live and you learn. It was difficult, but I was able to do it. Especially the iPad sleeve was like really hard to do on the envelope part. But I was able to do it. I'm definitely going to keep this in mind for next time because it was a workout for the brain and the hands. And this is how the straps look like and the iPad fits. Yay. This is how the bow looks like, which I really, really, really love. And the laptop fits in too. I am extremely happy with how these came out. They're so adorable. And if you're curious, I have been using these for the past week or so, and they're amazing. I'm really on the go, so I've gotten a lot of views out of them. They also felt very secure. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this. Bye!